Shalom. Welcome to Light to the Nations. When last we were together speaking about the temple, we were talking about the temple scroll, an important part of the oral tradition, which we realize is really part of the Torah that Hashem gave over at Mount Sinai, that was given over in every subsequent generation, which is essentially a blueprint for the temple according to the divine will. And we emphasized that the temple scroll is something that includes the fixed and the changeable aspects of the temple. In other words, when, based on that verse that we mentioned, if you remind yourselves of the verse in Chronicles where we see that David is instructing Solomon as far as everything that he received, that's what he gave over to his son Solomon. So, regarding the temple which Solomon built, he built everything according to that divine plan, and this is the temple scroll. And then we also understand that there's also room to grow, room for expansion, for progress, for innovation, and for interpretation according to the particular conditions of the situation as the generations progress. So this is a very important point. And we compared also the concepts of the first temple, the second temple, and the third temple as far as Ezekiel is concerned, and everything that Maimonides has taught us so far regarding the structure of the temple and those aspects which we have yet to delineate, but those aspects which are imperative and that it must be included according to the concept of the original temple scroll in order for the temple to be called a functioning mikdash. There are 2 points that I want to make now before we continue, or rather, actually 1 point that I want to emphasize. Okay, 2 points before we continue. One is that when we were talking about Ezekiel's vision, I mentioned that, there's even an opinion that was expressed by our sages that it's more or less a closed book and that there is so much of it that we don't perceive. And thus, according to halakha, the temple, which we are obligated to rebuild when the time presents itself, I won't say when the time comes, when the time presents itself because it's already here, but when the circumstances allow us to do everything that we have to do, so that temple is along the lines of the second temple with the interpolation of all of those details of Ezekiel's vision that hopefully at that time we will have the capacity to understand. And we mentioned again, this review is important to me at this point, we mentioned that that is precisely what the builders of the second temple did. They already included in their structure all that they had been able to understand from Ezekiel's vision, and we gave some examples, if you recall, of things that were included in the second temple that are actually derived from Ezekiel's vision. And at that point in that lesson, I emphasized that, it's really not possible to say that we understand Ezekiel's vision because it contains these elements of prophecy which we don't have the capacity to fully appreciate at this point, but in the future, as Isaiah says, the knowledge of God will cover the earth like the water of the sea. We'll have this expanded consciousness, this God consciousness, and then we'll know what it is that we have to do. Well, I just want to clarify a few things here because the truth is there are many, many interpretations of Ezekiel. There are many rabbinical opinions about what these verses mean, and there are in fact those that have constructed elaborate models and have offered diagrams, and there are whole volumes of important tradition regarding Ezekiel's vision. Some of it is more in the spiritual realm, what these things represent, which of course at this particular moment in a way doesn't really interest me because we are emphasizing right now the practical application of the commandment to build, notwithstanding the fact that of course there is a spiritual dimension, there is a mystical interpretation, but at the moment that's not our issue because we're talking about the actual physical commandment in this world that God loves so much, the physical world, that we have to function according to the Torah that God gave us, as it's written, you shall live by them. So I'm not talking about those interpretations right now. But besides that, there are also many interpretations that do certainly opine that they have an understanding of how everything is supposed to be set up. So I need to clarify this point. It's important. We're not saying that we have no idea what Ezekiel is talking about, and we have absolutely no way of perceiving it, and we can't put it together, and it's ridiculous to say that we do understand it, because you'll find that there are many great rabbis that have a very clear interpretation of those verses. But what we mean to say here, and what Maimonides is actually incorporating into halakha, and that's very important, because he explains, as we stated, and as I reviewed for you now, when it comes time to build the temple, we build according to Bayit Sheni, according to the second temple, and then we will be able to refurbish, as it were, according to Ezekiel. It's not that we have no understanding of it at all. It's that ultimately, because there is so much of it which we admit we are, by necessity, needing a higher level of spiritual perception, guidance, wisdom, capacity for, we say, listen, we are not on that level. It's a sort of exercise, if you will, in humility, to be able to realize that there are things that are beyond us at this point. This is not so politically correct and not really something that people are used to doing, because everybody really likes to say that they understand everything and that, we certainly know much more than they did in those generations, and how can you say that there could be something of God that is beyond human comprehension? Well, that's not the Torah's attitude at all, of course. When we take, for example, the whole concept of the red heifer, which is the embodiment of a divine mystery, which God tells us in advance, don't bother thinking that you can ever even understand this in this world, because there are things that are part of the wisdom of the Almighty which are beyond the realm of human comprehension, because we just don't have what it takes to understand it in this world. Now, I'm not saying that Ezekiel's vision is on the level of the red heifer, but it is not something that we have total access to, given the situation of our limited, I won't call it intellect, but limited perception at this point. Okay, so it's not that we don't understand it at all, but that when it comes to building, we're obligated only to build according to that which we do totally understand. That's one point I wanted to clarify. Another thing that I want to clarify before we move on is that when it came to Solomon's temple, there are some major differences that were featured, certain features that Solomon included in his structure that did not return, that were not included in the second temple. Now, obviously, everything that Solomon included in Bayit Rishon, in his first temple, was based on the temple scroll. It was based on his understanding of the temple scroll, and also it was based on certain very specific spiritual needs and counterparts in the spiritual worlds that Solomon was dealing with at that particular time in history, in order to bring about a rectification of these themes. In English, what do I mean? Is that there were certain things that Solomon, in his great wisdom and with his great spiritual perception, he was aware that these things were necessary, and thus we find that in the first temple there were a number of things that we don't find again in the second temple. And even though it's the period of the second temple which is recorded in the body of halakha as that which we have to rebuild. So as we're going to see, in the sanctuary of the second temple, there were three major vessels. There was the menorah, the candelabra, there was the golden table of the showbread, and there was the incense altar. However, as you see here, based on verses from the book of Kings, in King Solomon's temple, the first temple, the sanctuary was different. There were actually 11 menorot, an additional 10, and 11 tables of the showbread. So it was totally different than the second temple. So also there were a number of other innovations that Solomon included in his structure. There was the famed brazen sea, the Yam Shel Shlomo, which you can see here in this depiction, which was basically a reservoir of water that, according to some opinions, supplied the needs of all the water in the sanctuary. There were also carts which ferried the water about from place to place, as was deemed necessary. The structure of Solomon's temple was somewhat different, again, along the lines of the tabernacle, reflecting the basic structure of the tabernacle, as we're going to discuss now, but not exactly as it was in the time of the Second Temple, as we'll discuss in greater detail. So those 2 points that I wanted to make, that I don't mean to say that we have no perception whatsoever of Ezekiel, but that we just admit that we can't fully comprehend it. And number 2, that because now we're going to be somewhat skipping over the period of the First Temple, and we're going to go right into discussing some of the details of the Second Temple, I wanted to point out to you some of these differences between the First Temple and the Second Temple, and also wanted to show you and emphasize to you, both from the outside and from the inside, how unique and different Solomon's Temple was. So now let's return to Maimonides, and now continuing with Halacha Hey. And here's where it gets really interesting, because essentially until now, the Rambam has been explaining for us the history of the build-up, as it were, the generations of the temple from the time that the commandment was first received, really, beginning with Halacha Aleph. In the beginning, we began to say it is a positive commandment to erect the house for God, ready to be bringing the offerings, because of the verse, and you shall make for me a sanctuary. And then we explained that the tabernacle, which Moshe oversaw, the construction of it in the desert, that was something temporary. And then we began to explain again, once Israel entered into the land, the history of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, where it was in each place for how many years, and the difference of the structure of the tabernacle and in Shiloh. And then the interesting point that once the temple was built in Jerusalem, it became forbidden to bring an offering anywhere else, and the permanence of the sanctity of the place of the altar on Mount Moriah. And then, just what we finished up with the last time, the differences, the concept that Shlomo's temple, King Solomon's temple, is explained in the Book of Kings, and the Book of Ezekiel describes the structure of the future temple, even though it is not fully comprehensible. And the people who returned to build the Second Temple in the days of Ezra built somewhat along the lines of Solomon's temple and somewhat along the lines of Ezekiel. So, based on everything we understand until now regarding the concept of the temple scroll, which basically you know from that there are elements that must be included in order for the structure to be called the temple of God. And this is from the divine will, and that's why that part of the Torah that was given over is so important, because Hashem has His requirements for what the temple. So now we are up to the Rambam stating in a very lucid fashion, well, what are those requirements? What is the structure of the temple? That is the fixed structure, the outline of the temple, in order for it to be considered the house of God. And so, in Halacha Hey, Maimonides teaches us, Ve'elu hein hadvarim shehein ikar bebinyan habayit. And now, here are the major elements of the Holy Temple. There is a main structure of the temple, and that main structure is called the Heichal. And the Heichal means really sanctuary. And that portion of the temple, the most important portion, is basically divided into three parts. There is an outer hall, an entrance as it were. There is an area called the Holy, the Kodesh. And then there is an inner area called the Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies. Taken together, these three parts together constitute that which we refer to as the Heichal, the sanctuary. Now, actually, again, if you recall, in the very beginning, at one point of our study, we were talking about how the temple parallels the tabernacle, and that there is an aspect of that, while the proportion is increased very much so in the temple, the main elements and the main character follow. In other words, the temple is really an amplification of the tabernacle, but it's the same concept exactly. And here is where we really see that, because in the tabernacle stood the tent of meeting. In other words, within the courtyard, in the center stood the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. And that is really the same thing here as the Heichal. The Heichal, the sanctuary itself, is in the place of the tent of meeting, and the Heichal is divided into the Holy of Holies, and an outer entrance, as it were, an outer hall, which really, such a hall you don't see in the tabernacle, but really if you examine this illustration, you see that this space of an entrance is exactly along the lines of the ulam, of the outer hall, which leads into the sanctuary. Now, actually, I must point out that sometimes the term heichal, he yud chaf lamed, sanctuary, is a nickname, as it were, is a word that denotes the entire the entire building of, including the holy and the holy of holies and the outer hall. But sometimes when the word heichal is used, it only means the holy area and not the holy of holies. So it depends. Generally speaking, and then I'm speaking within Maimonides himself, sometimes he uses the word heichal referring to this entire structure, and sometimes he uses the word heichal referring only to the holy area. So, continuing, Maimonides says, "Ve'osin mechitza acheret saviv laheichal rechoka mimenu ke'en kalei hechatzer shayu bamidbar." And around the heichal, around the sanctuary, we erect a divider, a sort of mechitza, which means basically a division, all around the sanctuary at a distance of the same distance that the outer border of the courtyard in the tabernacle also stood. And so, v'chol hamukaf b'mechitza zo, shehu ke'en chatzar ohel moed, hu hanikra azara. Everything that is surrounded by this divider, by this wall, which is similar to the courtyard of the tent of meeting in the tabernacle, this entire area is called the Azara. Everything that you see here, within this area, everything within here is called the Azara, which, for lack of a better word, right now we will translate as the court. The whole structure of the court, really, is called Azara, and everything together, the Azara, the court, and the building of the Heichal, which is comprised of three parts, the outer hall, the holy, and the holy of holies, that's all called Mikdash. The word Azara, which means court, comes from a very beautiful concept. Where does this word come from? If you recognize it, Ayin, Zayin, Resh, He, Azara is like Ezra, which means help. And really, our sages tell us that the word comes from this particular verse in Psalms 46. In Psalms 46 we read, "To the chief musician for the sons of Korach, a song to Alamot, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." And the pasuk is, "Elokim lanu machseh," God is our refuge, ve'oz, and strength. Ezra b'tzarot nimtza me'od, an ever-present help in trouble. And so the word here of help, Ezra, is the same as Azara, the court of the temple, because one comes to the temple and cries out to God. So really, the name of the very structure itself, the name of the area of the temple, Azara, comes from the main purpose of the temple, which is to be the place for one to come to focus one's prayer and to pour out one's heart to God. So that's really a very beautiful concept. So in this particular entry, Maimonides is really teaching us, now that we have learned so much about the fact that there are basic requirements to be included in the temple in order for it to be, as it were, kosher, in order for it to be that which is included in the temple scroll and that which is imperative. What are those parts? And again, as we continue in Maimonides and as we continue bringing other sources, we are going to be getting more and more specific about the details pertaining to each facet of the temple and the service and the vessels. In the meantime, now, we are basically learning that there is a central structure which must be included. And these are the main aspects of the building of the temple: the holy and the holy of holies, and the outer hall, which is outside of the holy area. That taken together, generally speaking, all three form the sanctuary. The wall or the divider around the sanctuary, similar to the outer fence, as it were, that existed in the courtyard around the tent of meeting in the tabernacle. And again, everything included within this division, like that courtyard of the tabernacle, of the tent of meeting, is called Azara, which comes from the word help, because Hashem is a help in our distress. And everything taken all together, this entire area, is called the temple, the Mikdash. So now, as we continue, we're going to be learning about what has to be included within this area, namely the vessels. Which vessels are intrinsically imperative in order to commence with the temple service? Can we begin the temple service now? Perhaps we don't need any vessels to begin the divine service, or perhaps certain vessels must be present. And we're going to be learning about how the structure has to be built. What are the materials that are necessary? What are the circumstances? Who must participate? And of course, some of the more complicated aspects of the temple are, for example, the altar. Where is the altar located? How is the altar to be built? All of these things are part of a very specific tradition which has never been altered, which has been preserved very, very carefully, and which is the subject of a great deal of elucidation within these pages and the pages of many others of our sages of Israel. And we're going to see that there are tremendous amounts of insight and wisdom and detail regarding every single one of these aspects of this commandment. And really, it's all waiting to be fulfilled. And the more that we study these things, the more we will be capable of bringing them, God willing, to their fruition when the time comes. Again, there are two aspects of our study together. One aspect is the fact that our sages teach us that the more we study about the temple, the more God reckons it as if we are actually dealing with the sacrifices, as if we are actually, in a way, building the temple through our study. But we're not going to suffice with that, and we're not going to feel complacent in that, oh, Hashem is giving us the credit of dealing with the temple because we are studying the temple. We are studying on the condition of action. Our sages say, Lilmod al menat lasot. The highest level of learning is learning for the purpose of doing. And may it be God's will that He allows us the great merit of using our knowledge for His purpose so that we can participate in the building of the temple when the time comes, and thus allow the light of the divine presence to return to the world, the light to Israel, and the light to the nations.